The scratching started at 3:17 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone screen when it began. That soft scraping sound coming from somewhere inside the walls of my apartment. At first I thought it was mice or maybe the building settling, but then I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It sounded like fingernails dragging across wood. Slow and deliberate, as if something was trying to claw its way out from the inside. Have you ever experienced something so terrifying that your mind refuses to accept what your senses are telling you? That moment when reality becomes so twisted that you start questioning your own sanity. Because that is exactly what happened to me 3 months ago. And what I'm about to share with you will challenge everything you think you know about the world we live in. My name is Sarah, and until recently I was just another graduate student living in a cramped studio apartment near the university. I spent my days buried in research papers and my nights working part-time at a local coffee shop. Nothing about my life was particularly interesting or unusual. I was the kind of person who blended into crowds, who never attracted attention, who lived a perfectly ordinary existence. But sometimes ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, and when that happens, the results can be absolutely devastating. The apartment building I lived in was old, probably built sometime in the 1940s, with thick walls and creaky floors that groaned under the weight of decades. The landlord had painted over years of wear and tear, but you could still see the ghost outlines of old wallpaper bleeding through the cheap latex paint. My unit was on the 3rd floor, tucked away at the end of a dimly lit hallway that always smelled faintly of cigarettes, and something else I could never quite identify. For the first 6 months I lived there, everything was perfectly normal. I had quiet neighbours, reliable heating, and rent I could actually afford on my meagre income. The only complaint I had was about the thin walls that let me hear Mrs. Chen upstairs practicing her violin at odd hours, but even that became oddly comforting after a while. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened, where you could live for years without anyone knowing your name. But then the scratching started, and everything changed. The first night I heard it, I convinced myself it was nothing. Old buildings make strange noises, I reasoned. Pipes expand and contract, wood shifts with temperature changes, and urban wildlife finds ways into the most unlikely places. I rolled over in bed and tried to ignore the sound, but it continued for nearly an hour, always coming from the same spot in the wall behind my headboard. The next morning I mentioned it to my downstairs neighbour, Mr. Rodriguez, who had lived in the building for over 15 years. He listened to my description with a strange expression on his face, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup tighter than necessary. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment, staring past me at something I could not see. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me that the previous tenant in my apartment, a young woman named Elena, had moved out suddenly in the middle of the night. She had left behind all her furniture, her clothes, even her car parked outside. The landlord never heard from her again, and her security deposit covered the cost of cleaning out her belongings. Mr. Rodriguez said Elena had complained about noises in the walls during her last few weeks there, but everyone assumed she was just stressed from graduate school. That conversation should have been a warning, but I was too practical to believe in ghost stories or supernatural explanations. I figured Elena had probably just had a nervous breakdown and fled town. It happens to graduate students more often than people realize. The pressure can break even the strongest minds, and sometimes running away seems like the only option. So I ignored Mr. Rodriguez's concerned looks and continued with my routine. During the day, I attended classes and worked on my thesis about urban decay and gentrification. At night, I served coffee to bleary-eyed students and tried not to think about the scratching sounds that seemed to be getting louder each evening. By the end of the first week, the sounds had developed a rhythm. 3 short scratches, a pause, then 7 longer ones. It repeated this pattern endlessly, always starting at the same time and always coming from the exact same spot in the wall. I pressed my ear against the plaster and could feel vibrations running through the building's frame, as if something was moving through the spaces between the walls. I called the landlord and reported a possible rodent problem. he sent an exterminator who found no evidence of mice or rats anywhere in the building. The man was thorough, checking every possible entry point and setting traps in all the common areas. When he finished his inspection, he seemed genuinely puzzled by my complaint. The exterminator told me he had been working in the city for over 20 years and had never encountered a rodent infestation that produced such regular, rhythmic sounds. Mice and rats move erratically, he explained, following food sources and avoiding human activity. They do not scratch in patterns or maintain consistent schedules. His professional opinion was that I was dealing with something else entirely. That night, the scratching was so loud it woke me from a deep sleep. I lay in bed listening to the methodical pattern, and for the first time I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The scratches were not random marks made by claws or teeth. They had depth and purpose, like someone was carving symbols or letters into the wood inside the wall. I grabbed a flashlight and examined the wall behind my bed, running my hands over the painted surface. The plaster was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been in the middle of winter. As I pressed my palm against the wall, the scratching stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making the sound had sensed my presence. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. It felt expectant, like something was waiting just on the other side of the wall, listening to my breathing and watching for my next move. I kept my hand pressed against the warm plaster for what felt like hours, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might provoke a response. When morning came, I found something that changed everything. Carved into the paint behind my headboard, so faint I had missed it before, were letters. They were crude and uneven, as if someone had used their fingernails to scratch words into the wall. The message was simple, but terrifying in its implications. It said, "Help me." The letters were fresh, the paint around them still slightly raised where it had been disturbed. Someone or something had carved those words during the night while I slept just inches away from the wall. But that was impossible. The wall was solid plaster over wooden lath, part of the building's original construction. There was no way anyone could access the space behind it without tearing through my apartment or the one next door. I took pictures of the carved message with my phone, though the letters were so faint the camera barely picked them up. As I studied the images, I noticed something else that made my hands shake. The scratches were made from the inside of the wall, not the outside. Whatever had carved those words was trapped in the space between the rooms, clawing desperately at the barrier that separated it from my bedroom. That realization hit me like a physical blow. Something was alive in the walls of my building, something that could think and communicate and was desperately trying to reach out for assistance. But what could possibly survive in such a confined space, and how long had it been trapped there? The questions multiplied in my mind as I stared at those two simple words carved into the paint. Help me. It was a plea, a cry for assistance from something that existed in the darkness between the walls. And somehow, impossibly, it knew I was there. I started researching the building's history that same afternoon, digging through city records and newspaper archives at the university library. What I found made the scratching sounds seem even more sinister than before. The building had been constructed in 1942 as emergency housing for factory workers during the war. The original blueprints showed a maze of narrow corridors and cramped living spaces, designed to house as many people as possible in the smallest amount of space. But there were discrepancies in the architectural plans. Sections of the building that appeared on the original drawings had been sealed off during a renovation in 1968. Entire rooms and hallways had been walled up and forgotten, creating a hidden network of spaces that existed between the official apartments. The renovation records cited structural concerns, but the details were vague and incomplete. More disturbing were the missing person reports I found in the newspaper archives. Over the decades, several tenants had vanished without explanation. Eleanor was just the most recent in a long line of disappearances that stretched back to the building's early years. Most of the missing people were young women living alone, students or factory workers who had few close connections in the city. The pattern was always the same. Neighbours would report strange noises coming from the missing person's apartment. The sounds would continue for several days or weeks, then suddenly stop. When landlords or police finally investigated, they would find the apartments empty but undisturbed, as if the occupants had simply evaporated into thin air. I printed copies of every article I could find and spread them across my kitchen table. As I read through the accounts, I noticed that many of the witnesses described the same rhythmic scratching sounds I had been hearing. 3 short scratches, followed by 7 longer ones, always emanating from inside the walls, always beginning in the early morning hours. The oldest report dated back to 1953, when a factory worker named Margaret Sullivan disappeared from the apartment directly below mine. Her neighbour had complained to the police about scratching noises that continued for 3 weeks after Margaret's disappearance. The investigating officer had dismissed the sounds as settling timber and closed the case without further investigation. But Margaret's story was different from the others in one crucial detail. A maintenance worker had reported seeing her face pressed against a window in the building's basement, even though there were no windows in the basement level. When police investigated, they found no trace of Margaret or any way she could have accessed the space behind the supposed window. That evening, I stood in my apartment staring at the carved message in the wall. The letters seemed deeper now, more pronounced, as if whatever had made them was growing stronger or more desperate. I pressed my ear against the plaster and heard something that made my skin crawl. It was breathing, slow and laboured, coming from somewhere deep within the building structure. The sound was undeniably human, but wrong somehow. The rhythm was too irregular, the pauses too long, as if whoever was making the sound was struggling to remember how breathing was supposed to work. I counted the intervals between breaths and realised they matched the pattern of the scratching. 3 short inhales, a pause, then 7 longer exhales. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox and began tapping along the wall, listening for hollow spaces or structural weaknesses. Most of the wall sounded solid, but there was a section about 3 feet wide where the sound changed. The hollow echo suggested an empty space behind the plaster, a gap that should not have existed according to the building's floor plan. As I tapped along the wall, the breathing sounds grew more agitated. The rhythm became faster and more erratic, accompanied by a new sound that made my blood run cold. It was whimpering, the kind of desperate crying that comes from someone who has given up all hope of rescue. The sound was muffled by layers of plaster and wood, but there was no mistaking the human quality of the distress. I set the hammer aside and placed both hands against the warm section of wall. The whimpering stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like frantic scratching. New letters began appearing in the paint, carved by invisible fingernails working from the inside. This time the message was longer and more urgent. Been here so long, can't remember sunlight. Please don't leave me alone again. The words appeared slowly, each letter carved with painstaking effort. I could feel vibrations through the wall as whatever was trapped inside worked desperately to communicate. When the message was complete, the scratching stopped and the breathing resumed, now accompanied by what sounded distinctly like sobbing. I sat on my bed, staring at the fresh carved words until my vision blurred with tears. Someone was trapped in the walls of my building, someone who had been there long enough to forget what sunlight looked like. The implications were horrifying. How many of the missing tenants had never actually left the building? How many were still trapped in the hidden spaces between the official apartments, slowly going mad in the darkness? The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching the building's renovation history. I needed to find the original contractor who had sealed off those sections in 1968. If anyone knew how to access the hidden spaces, it would be someone who had worked on the construction. After hours of phone calls and internet searches, I tracked down the son of the original contractor. His father had died years earlier, but he still had boxes of old blueprints and work orders stored in his garage. When I explained what I was looking for, he agreed to meet me that afternoon. Thomas Brennan was in his 70s with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in construction. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally nodding as if he had heard similar accounts before. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the blueprints spread across his kitchen table. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with regret. He told me his father had never talked much about the work they did on my building, but Thomas remembered helping with the renovation when he was just a teenager. There had been problems with the original construction, spaces that did not match the official plans, rooms that seemed to exist in architectural limbo. The city had ordered those spaces sealed for safety reasons, but Thomas's father had always suspected there was more to the story. The building's original owner had been involved in some kind of scandal during the war years, something involving missing workers and unexplained disappearances. The renovation had been a way to hide the evidence, to wall up the past and pretend it never existed. Thomas pulled out a set of hand-drawn modifications his father had made to the official blueprints. The drawings showed a complex network of hidden passages and sealed rooms that existed throughout the building. Some of the spaces were large enough to hold entire apartments, while others were narrow crawlways that connected different sections of the structure. According to the drawings, there was an access point in the basement that led into the hidden network. Thomas's father had left it unsealed despite the city's orders because he believed someone might need to access those spaces someday for maintenance or emergency purposes. He had hidden the entrance behind a false wall in the building's utility room. As Thomas traced the passages on the blueprint with his finger, I realized the full scope of what I was dealing with. The scratching sounds were coming from a sealed apartment that existed parallel to mine, separated by just a few inches of plaster and wooden framework. If someone was trapped in there, they had been living in complete darkness for an unknown period of time, sustained by whatever they could find in the building's forgotten spaces. The blueprint showed that the sealed apartment had its own bathroom and kitchen, though the utilities had been disconnected decades ago. There were ventilation shafts that connected to the main building's air system, which explained how someone could survive in such a confined space. But it also meant that whatever was trapped in there could potentially access other parts of the building through the ductwork. That realization filled me with a new kind of terror. If the entity in the walls could move through the ventilation system, then nowhere in the building was truly safe. It could be watching me right now through the air vents, listening to my conversations, learning my routines and habits. The thought made every shadow seem threatening and every unexpected sound a potential warning of danger. Thomas agreed to meet me at the building that evening to help locate the hidden entrance. He insisted on bringing his own flashlight and a crowbar, tools that suggested he expected to find more than just empty rooms behind the false wall. As we made plans to explore the sealed sections, I could not shake the feeling that I was about to discover something that would change my understanding of reality forever. The carved message in my bedroom wall had grown longer during the day, new words appearing while I was away meeting with Thomas. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I found a desperate plea that made my hands tremble as I read it. They took us one by one, made us disappear. But we never left. We're all still here waiting in the dock. Please help us remember what it feels like to be human again. Like to be human again. The words carved into my wall that evening were different from the others. Where the previous messages had been crude and desperate, these new letters showed an almost artistic quality, as if whoever was creating them was regaining some lost skill or memory. The handwriting was more controlled, more deliberate, and somehow more terrifying because of it. I met Thomas at the building's entrance at 8:30 that night. He carried a canvas bag filled with tools that clinked softly as he walked, and his face wore the grim expression of someone who had seen too much over the years. We descended to the basement through a narrow stairwell that seemed to grow colder with each step, the air thick with the smell of decades of accumulated moisture and decay. The utility room was exactly where Thomas remembered it, hidden behind a door marked with faded warnings about electrical hazards. Inside, ancient pipes ran along the ceiling like metallic veins, and the walls were lined with circuit breakers and water valves that probably had not been touched in years. But Thomas moved with purpose, walking directly to what appeared to be a solid concrete wall at the far end of the room. He ran his hands along the surface until he found what he was looking for, a slight depression in the concrete that indicated the presence of the false wall his father had constructed. Using the crowbar, he began chipping away at the edges where the fake section met the real foundation. The work was slow and methodical, each strike of the tool echoing through the basement like gunshots in the silence. After 20 minutes of careful demolition, Thomas had created a hole large enough for us to squeeze through. The space beyond was pitch black, but our flashlight beams revealed a narrow corridor that stretched away into darkness. The walls were original brick, covered in decades of dust and spider webs, and the floor was littered with debris that crunched under our feet as we moved forward. The corridor led to a junction where several passages branched off in different directions. Thomas consulted his father's blueprint, tracing our route with his finger before pointing toward a passage that angled upward toward the main floors of the building. According to the drawing, this route would take us to the sealed apartment that existed behind my bedroom wall. We found them all. 23 bodies in various states of preservation, trapped in rooms that had been sealed for decades. Some were recent, like Elena, who had only been missing for a few months. Others were nothing more than bones and tattered clothing, victims of a building owner who had been systematically murdering tenants and hiding the evidence behind walls. The scratching sounds had been their final, desperate attempts to communicate with the living world, to tell someone that they were still there, still trapped in the darkness between life and death. I moved out the next day, but I still hear those sounds sometimes in my dreams. 3 short scratches, then 7 longer ones, a rhythm that haunts me whenever the world grows too quiet.